There's no doubt that if you're shooting Sony E-mount, this 90mm is the best macro lens to get, especially if you're shooting full frame. However, I'm shooting APS-C now, and 90mm on a small sensor isn't always the most ideal pairing. So I found this 7Artisan 60mm f2.8 lens. Here's a comparison of cheap versus expensive. Let's find out what you're really paying for, and how it plays out beyond the spec sheet, so that you can pick the best tool for you and your needs. Hey fam, mga kapatid. I'm Mike, nurse photographer and videographer. Alright, right off the bat, the 7Artisan lens sells at $179, and the Sony 90mm macro sells for $1,099.99. Both of them have metal construction and are tough. However, the 90mm macro is weather sealed while the 7Artisan 60mm is not. The 7Artisan 60mm weighs in at 14 ounces or 399 grams, and the Sony comes in at almost twice the size at 1.32 pounds or 602 grams. The 7Artisan 60mm has no buttons and only focus and aperture rings. The Sony 90mm comes with the focus hold button, AF, MF switch, and additional focusing distance switch. Using the ring of the Sony lens, you can easily switch between autofocus and manual focus control, whereas only being limited to manual focus for the 7Artisan lens. The Sony 90mm is of course focused by wire, so no hard stops when it comes to manipulating your focus ring, but you can still have the benefit of having the measurements near the focus ring. Even though you'll probably only shoot food, insects, or product shots with this lens, you can still expect the eye and face autofocus to perform well in combination with your Sony camera body. The Sony has sharpness all around, where the 7Artisan macro has most of its sharpness in the middle, stopped down at f2.8, and starts softening towards the edges. For the 7Artisan lens, you have to stop down some more to f5.6 to start seeing more noticeable sharpness at the edges. Prior to these lenses, I've been using macro extension tubes, and both of these macro lenses perform way better than these do. I've paired this up with the Sony 85mm f1.8 as well as the Sony 24-105mm f4 in the past, yet most of my shots came out pretty soft. These extension tubes are pretty inexpensive compared to native macro lenses, so I figured this was worth a try. In terms of personal use out of these macro lenses, I believe it was Peter McKinnon who said that you could use a Canon 100mm macro lens as a portrait lens. Naturally, I assumed that the same would be for the 90mm, and he was right. But that's only part of the truth. Due to the nature of the macro lenses being made for the purpose for making things up close and tack sharp, it's not exactly the lens that you want to use for your portraits, especially with less than perfect skin. I guess it can be true if they say, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies macro, because with the 90mm, you'll have no problem pointing out your enemy's flaws in their skin. Aside from this, you'll just have a blast just pointing the 90mm towards objects up close and even a fair distance away, like animals, while getting much detail. In regards to the Artisan 60mm lens, it's also a great compact macro lens that you'll be able to get sharp detail with, despite having a couple imperfections and not having autofocus. Most of the time, I do end up framing my macro subjects in the center, and if I do want to focus on a subject in the corner, it's not a big deal to stop down, especially in controlled environments like my studio or outside in broad daylight. If I need to, I could use like my Aperture AL-F7 or MC to film some light for some lower light situations. 90mm to 100mm is a typical focal length for macro lenses in that full frame range, and it's okay for me to use it too if I were using a full frame camera. However, since I'm using APS-C, it gives me a 135mm focal length. This requires me to back up, and more often than not, I do end up backing up into odd places or just not being able to move back at all. Fortunately, you can still focus up to any distance between 0.5 centimeters to wherever you're standing, infinity and beyond. So despite my home studio being the size of a small bedroom, I was able to get good shots. These macro tubes just immediately obliterate everything on the closest edges possible, not even in the corner. You didn't even get there yet. Anyway, what kind of stuff would you shoot with a macro lens? If you need the absolute best macro lens for the Sony E-mount system, the Sony 90mm macro is gold for the Sony shooter, no doubt about it. The Sony 90mm retails for $1099, but in the used market, you can get it as low as $660. But if you still want to get decent macro shots without breaking the bank, the 60mm macro lens from 7Artisan isn't terrible. It's actually a great lens. If you're curious about going true macro, it's time to put away the macro tubes that we got here and get some real glass. See some macro footage over here. Until next time, thanks again for watching. Now go out there and shoot for the life that matters. See ya!